Okay, excellent. Thank you everyone for your time today. I want to talk a little bit about an obscure epithet in Apuleius and how we can use comparative mythology and poetics to perhaps disambiguate it and what the ultimate implications are for a potential italic ritual formula. Now, first, to discuss the goals of the talk, I want to identify an obscure epithet in Apuleius, isolate the underlying collocation in the Cacus myth, compare the collocation to purificatory ritual in the Iguvine tables, and reconstruct a proto-Italic ritual formula, proto-pan-Italic. These kind of boundaries get a little bit fuzzy, but nevertheless, let's talk about the epithet itself that inspired all this. So, the Apuleius is a North African author of Latin who flourished around the 2nd century CE. He participated in the Second Sophistic and had a love of the antique. And ultimately, he was put on trial for witchcraft, but being a Platonist, he modeled his own apology after that of Socrates. Ultimately, he adduced many exempla from history and myth to defend himself. Among these is in fact that of Hercules. As he says, "He himself, I say, Hercules, the lustrator of the world, the purger of beasts, the breaker of nations, he, despite being a god, although he traversed many lands, was clothed in nothing more than a single pelt and was accompanied by nothing more than a single stick." I want to draw you to 3 words in this passage: Hercules Lustrator Orbis. Now, here I've translated this as Hercules, the lustrator of the world, in absence of a better translation, because as those of you who are familiar with Latin know, lustrare is a verb that has quite a number of meanings. So perhaps we could go about this by looking at the Apuleian corpus, trying to find another 3-word collocation that involves Hercules in the world, and try to see what might seem plausible. So we have one here from the Florida. Just as poets reminisce about how Hercules once overcame those inhuman monsters, both man and beast, with his virtue and purified the world, that is, orbemque terrae purgasse, which seems to suggest, okay, maybe this means purify, but we can't quite be 100% sure because there isn't that lexical equivalency. So maybe we can go to the whole of the Latin corpus, but before that, let's look at our options for potential Greek comparanda, just so that we can make sure we don't rule that out. So, assuming lustrare means purify, Hercules Lustrator Orbis can refer to his slaying of beasts, and there are 2 Greek comparanda which can present themselves. One from Sophocles, purging these many things which are on land and sea, and one from Euripides, recompense for the purifying of land and sea. But now, looking at lustrare, it also has these other 3 meanings. Besides purify, we have travel, survey, and go around. So how are we going to select the correct one? Well, one possible criterion is look at specifically this lexeme collocated with Hercules. Now, unfortunately, this does not make our job any easier, because all 4 of these are also attested with Hercules. But this does give us 2 interesting insights. Number 1, the association between Hercules and lustrare was opaque even to the speakers of classical Latin. And number 2, it also tells us that the collocation of Hercules and lustrare predates the diversification of meanings of lustrare. So here, I'm going to try to schematize all of the various different meanings for this verb in what I think is the most plausible way. Now, I'll be using a binary branching tree here, but I'm using it in a different manner than you oftentimes see them used in historical linguistics. While in historical linguistics, the diachronic grammars of these languages are oftentimes inaccessible to speakers of some sort of synchronic language, all of these meanings can coexist simultaneously in the synchronic grammar. And so really what this is to show is the semantic space in a way that doesn't have a need for quantitative methods or for formal semantics. So lustrare is etymologically a denominal from lustrum, which is a certain kind of ritual. So we can assume its etymological meaning is to perform a lustrum, but the primary use of this sacrifice is purification, so that's how we can trivially derive to purify. Furthermore, in a civic context, this ritual is described as involving a survey of the citizenry. Here we see this from this passage in Dionysus of Halicarnassus. And we also have 2 other meanings, both involving motion, one being to go around, and the other to travel. To go around, in fact, has a good parallel from Cato's De Agricultura, where we see the verbs circumagi and circumferenda in the description of performing a lustrum. So now that we've talked about these various meanings and established, okay, it looks like in primis, right, this is a verb that means to purify in some way, let's look at this specific episode in the Aeneid and in other works of Italic poetry and consider what could we pull out of this that could help illuminate what Hercules Lustrator Orbis could mean. So the Cacus episode is an extra-canonical labor of Hercules. It's not attested in the classical Greek tradition, and it's attested in 4 Latin sources: Virgil's Aeneid, Ovid's Fasti, Propertius, and Livy. The rough sketch of events is that Hercules leads the cattle of Geryon back through Italy. He stops near the site of future Rome to rest and pasture the cattle. Cacus steals his cattle and takes them back to a cave. Hercules realizes that his cattle are gone, and then proceeds to kill Cacus and retrieve his cattle. So looking at some instances of where lustrare show up in this, we have, and he moved his eyes here and there as he surveyed, lustrans, the whole approach, gnashing his teeth. Here we see it meaning survey. But we also, still in the Aeneid, see, incensed by rage, he goes around, lustrat, the Aventine Mount 3 times. 3 times he makes an attempt on the rocky ridges in vain, and 3 times he sat tired in the valley. Now moving on to Livy, when Hercules had fully surveyed his flock with his eyes and had sensed that part of their numbers were absent, here per lustraset, this also shows survey, but perhaps with a different object here, this time the gregem, the flock of cattle. And we also have some other instances that might serve to indicate some cases of lexical replacement, where we have the same semantic sphere as lustrare, but using different words. Here, the club bearer, having traveled the long path of the world, immensus longi orbis iter, is roughly equivalent to lustrator orbis if we assume a meaning traveler of the world. Now, while as demonstrated on slide 14, this is not the original meaning more than likely, it can be read as evidence for Ovid's familiarity with some formula, that is, Hercules travel, lustra, and world, which was synchronically active in his poetic grammar. In Propertius 4.9, we somewhat ironically see the verb piatur, the altar is purified, spoken to Hercules in the context of the Ara Maxima. This is a cult site in Rome that is later associated with Hercules. Now, what's interesting is not only that piare and lustrare are both synonymous in meaning purify, but it's also the fact that piare is, or its cognate word rather, is used to describe the ritual action of purification in the Iguvine tables, as we'll later see. This makes it perhaps a good candidate if we do choose to specify a lexical object in the italic formula we're going to be setting up. Now, finally, and I think perhaps most convincingly, we have this man, since he sanctified the world, purified by his hands, the people of Tatius's cures so dubbed him Sancus. Here we have 2 words for purify, purgatum and sanctarat, and it seems to be operating as part of a synchronic poetic formula, Hercules purify world. This seems to be matching our intuitions about not only the synchronic productivity of Hercules purify world that we established earlier, but also its origins in the near prehistory of the Latin language as perhaps the original meaning of this whole collocation. Now, obviously, this in and of itself is interesting and could be the subject of its own research, but I'd like to go a little bit further and discuss specifically who is this tantalizing Sancus that we see in this figura etymologica, sanctarat sancus. And for this, we're going to have to go to the Iguvine tables. But first, let's discuss a few methodological considerations that come from the field of historical linguistics. So, sound change is regular and exceptionless according to the neo-grammarian hypothesis. This is the methodological underpinning of what is known as the comparative method, which creates a set of cognate words, these are words from a common origin, that we can then use to establish relationships between languages like you see on the image in the right. Now, poetic formulae are embedded in myths and therefore transmitted by languages, and therefore the same comparative method we can use to study language change can also be used to study mythological and poetic change. So Latin is also part of this italic clade of the Indo-European languages. Any 2 italic languages are more closely related to one another than to any other Indo-European language that is outside of the italic clade. And among these, there are two uncontroversial subclades, Latino-Faliscan, consisting of Latin and Faliscan, and Sabellic, perhaps a little bit less known, consisting of Umbrian, Oscan, and South Piscine. The Iguvine tables are a set of 7 bronze tablets written in Umbrian, one of these languages we mentioned above. This is the language which is closely related to Latin, and also is part of this broader Italic clade besides its narrow Sabellic one. Now, these 7 tablets describe the ritual duties of the Asiadian brothers, who are a local cult of the city of Aguvium, modern Gubbio, in Umbria. Now, these texts are determined by Rix to have a common textual archetype that in fact is expressed in 2 different versions, one of them in the epicoric, that is local alphabet, and a newer version written in the Latin alphabet. Now there are 2 rituals, here I will be using the terms piaculum and lustratio following Rix, which are repeated in both recensions. Now, looking at instances of this divine name Sancus in the Iguvine tables, we can see that all of these, save for perhaps the bull sacrifice in 2b24, are either purificatory or expiatory, if we are to draw the distinction between them contexts. But what's more interesting is that 71% of them, overwhelmingly so in fact, are from the piaculum, which serves to purify the city, as is expressed in the actual text itself, ocrer peaner, for purifying the city. Now, let's try to shine some light on the Aeneid by comparing passages from the Iguvine tables to the Cacus episode, and in doing so, perhaps broaden our understanding of Sancus and Hercules and their similarities. Incensed by rage, he goes around the Aventine Mount 3 times. 3 times he makes an attempt on the rocky ridges in vain. 3 times he sat tired in the valley. Now compare this to the Iguvine tables. Then let them go around a 3rd time. When they have come to the boundary again, they must pray in the same manner. In the same manner, he must tell them that they must go. Now, here we have a ritual procession, which circles the target 3 times, and each time, the officiant stops to perform a ritual action. Now, furthermore, the passage from the Iguvine tables is part of the Lustratio, in which Sancus is invoked as a guarantor of the ritual, and the stated goal is ritual purification. Now, moving on to Livy, you can compare the passage above to then say, be in priestly order, be in military order, Iguvinians, then go around with the Prenuati and the unblemished victims. Now, we already established above that when the Roman citizenry are being lustrated, they are surveyed in their military ranks. But we also see here this kind of stationing of the Iguvine citizens into their military and priestly ranks, which seems to likewise imply some sort of a survey. Now, it therefore stands that in Livy 1.7, Hercules surveys his cattle like citizens. This is seen in the use of gregem, which obviously can refer to flocks, but oftentimes also refers to men in a martial context, much like we see with the companions of Aeneas. And finally, I just want to talk a little bit about structures within Book 8 of the Aeneid more broadly, because we have this passage at the beginning. A giant sow found beneath holm oaks along the shore will be lying down after having given birth to her 30 heads of offspring, white and lying down alone, her white children around her teats. Now, compare this to the Iguvine tables, where we have behind the Thessanakian gates, sacrifice 3 suckling, lactating pigs, it's a little bit unsure what this word means, to Physis Sentius, rather. Now, this is part of a propitiatory sacrifice performed to Juno at the beginning of Book 8. And what's interesting is that it's immediately followed by a ritual feast at the Ara Maxima, as we said earlier, associated with Hercules, and also is followed by the Cacus episode, which serves as an etiology for this sacrifice. Now, it seems that Aeneid Book 8 shows a thorough understanding of expiatory rituals in Iron Age Italy, which I think deserves further study. Now here's the part where we discuss the poetic formula itself. So we've already got Sancus, we've already got the action of the formula, right, purification, but now the question is, what is the target? Should we choose the world or the city? The world is attested in Apuleius, it's also attested in Propertius, but as we saw earlier, the Iguvine tables are explicitly talking about the city, and also considering that the ritual action is so similar in Virgil's Aeneid, we can also probably consider that to be part of that same tradition of city purification. Well, I of course decided, why don't we split the difference on this, since Weiss has argued that Umbrian okar, which refers to cities, has undergone a semantic development boundary to city, and this he compares to Middle Irish ochar, which means border, edge, or rim. We likewise see in city foundation contexts, the Roman pomerium is considered a microcosmos. Now the pomerium is the furrow which marks the city within as sanctified, and in the process of founding a colony, colonists throw their native soil into the center, seeming to symbolize the collection of all lands together. What's also interesting is the word used to refer to either the pomerium or the outer boundary of it, which is orbis, which not only literally refers to a circle, but also refers to the world, as we see associated with Sancus and Hercules above. Now, considering that Propertius's testimony suggests that Sancus was common to both traditions, the etymology and plausible semantic development sketched for Lustrare suggests that purification is associated with Sancus in both traditions, and third, that Sancus purifies the ritual boundary, which stands in for the world, I argue that we can reconstruct an italic poetic formula, Sancus purify, perhaps with the specified lexeme pia, which we see attested in both traditions, world. Now, to summarize, Hercules subsumed the function of Sancus in the Roman pantheon, Sancus's role in purifying the city is reflected in the Cacus episode, and semantic ambiguities transmitted in the Cacus episode guarantee the antiquity of the ritual formula, Sancus purify world, and argue against Greek influence. That being said, there are some issues which I think merit further study, which I'd like to bring to your attention. First, it would be interesting to examine structural similarities between Aeneid 8 as a whole and Italic ritual. Also, I think one needs to explain the attributes of Hercules and Sancus, which made them amenable to syncretism. And finally, I think it would be interesting to compare the Cacus episode to the Vala myth that we see in the Indic tradition, because perhaps this can shed light on these properties of Sancus that made him so amenable to syncretism. Now, I'd like to thank you all for your time and open the floor to questions.